Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We already have about 200 people here with us from all across the country, which is really incredible. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. But as folks are joining us, we'd love it if folks could just pop in their name and let us know where you're joining from. Actually, I'm realizing we might have the chat disabled, so that's going to make this hard. Um, so shoot me a DM or whatever we're doing to host and panelists is perfect. Let us know where you're calling in from and we'll shout it out. We have people from Kansas and California, Nashville, and all over California. Uh, Lots of folks from Kentucky, San Francisco, Boulder, Oakland, West Virginia, Sacramento, Maryland, Fredericksburg, Indiana, Omaha, Eugene, Oregon, Seattle, California, Colorado, Baltimore, Florida, Miami, Vermont, Maryland, lots of Maryland folks here, Missouri, Illinois, Washington, more Maryland, Seattle, uh, DC, just down the road from where I am, San Francisco, Philadelphia, Colorado, Chicago, Illinois, Des Moines, Colorado, Delaware, Northern California, Florida, Rome, New York, Ohio, Michigan, Chicago. This is incredible, y'all. We have 270 folks on from all across the country. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar that's going to be examining the impacts 1 year in of Trump's anti-homeless executive order. We're going to get started in a few minutes. We still have a ton of people who are logging in, and we're going to just wait a few more minutes so we can get started and everybody's here. But as you join in, please let us know where you're signing in from in the chat, and I'm going to try my best to read it out. We have Upper Peninsula of Michigan, Washington, uh, Carson City, Nevada, Massachusetts, Illinois, Texas, West Palm Beach, Chicago, Connecticut, Ohio, California, Tennessee, Delaware, Nebraska, Connecticut, DC. Wow, this is amazing. New Jersey, Nebraska, Pennsylvania, Michigan. I think we have folks from almost every state here. Yes, we have Hawaii, Aloha Darcy, or Aloha Lisa Darcy, New York, Missouri, Tennessee, Michigan, France. Hi, Danica. It's so good to see you. Um, and Will, this is like it's so amazing to see different friends from all across the country and all across the world. Ohio, California, um, Chicago, New York City, Houston, Salt Lake City, Florida, um, Twin Cities, England, cool, Arkansas, Georgetown, Texas, Chicago, New York. And to everyone who's just joining us, thank you so much for being here. We're going to get started in just 1 or 2 minutes. But as folks are joining us, please let us know where you're calling in from in the chat so we can see who else is here. We have lots of Philadelphia, Scranton, Tacoma, Washington, Philly, Buffalo, DC, Rochester, New York City, Santa Rosa, uh, Raleigh, North Carolina, Massachusetts, everyone, Nevada, Indiana. I think we have most, if not every state here. We have, hi, Dad. We have my dad from Norfolk, Virginia. We got Philly. This is awesome, y'all. We're going to get started just in 30 seconds. It still looks like we have a few people who are signing in, but this is a really incredible showing. For those of y'all I haven't met yet, hi, my name is Jesse Rabinowitz. I am the Campaign and Communications Director at the National Homelessness Law Center, and I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm based in Washington, D.C., and it's just so good to be with all of you right now. And it's powerful to see folks from across the country and across the world showing up for this issue and for this webinar. And to me, it shows that we're really building a strong movement of power, not just to fight against this resurgence of anti-homelessness, rhetoric and laws and policy, but we're building a base of people for which we can fight for a country where everybody has the housing and support they need. Um, Again, thank you all so much for being here from all across the world. I was talking with a friend last night, and she said that her six-year-old son said at bedtime, "Not everyone has a cozy bed to be in. Not everyone has a home, and that's not fair." And he's right. And I often wonder why it is so hard for us grown-ups to understand this. And my hope is that together we can remind ourselves and politicians what little kids seem to get intuitively. Homelessness isn't fair. Homelessness doesn't need to exist, and everybody needs a home. I think society is judged by how it treats people living outside and people experiencing homelessness. And if that's the metric, we have a lot of work to do. Right now, we're seeing a retreat from real solutions and back towards failed policies. We're seeing the increased demonization of homeless folks instead of solutions, and we're seeing a rejection of our shared humanity. And sadly, politicians would rather use homelessness as a political football than use their power to help people. And this afternoon, we'll dive into the horrific implications of Trump's anti-homeless executive order that was signed 1 year ago last week. And as we go into this conversation, I want you to ask yourself, over the past year, what have you seen? What have you noticed? Has your rent gone down? Have your healthcare costs decreased? Is food or gas cheaper? Or are we seeing things take a turn for the worst? We can move to the next slide. We have an incredible crew of people from just the smartest people you can think of who are going to talk about this. We're going to dive into what was in the EO. We'll hear from Congressmember Ramirez. My old friend Andy from Miriam's Kitchen is going to talk about the DC takeover. Um, Evan is going to join us to talk about the proposed Utah detention camp and how that connects to Trump's EO. Shayna is going to join us to talk about Louisiana's newly passed law that might force homeless people into labor. Mary Frances from the National Alliance is going to talk about HUD funding changes and a lawsuit. We'll be joined by Representative Mark Decano to talk about how this has impacted homeless veterans. Jennifer Mathis from the Bazelon Center is going to talk about the concerted attacks on folks with mental health needs. Cassandra from the Drug Policy Alliance is going to help us understand the connections between Trump's EO and the attack on people who use drugs. And then we'll close out with some really inspiring words from our dear friend, Representative Maxwell Frost. Before we do that, I'm just going to walk us through a little bit of a refresher about what's in the executive order. We're seeing a bunch of requests in the chat. Yes, we will share the slides, and this is being recorded. So if you are seeing this, we will be sending out a recording to everyone who has registered for this, and we'll also be posting it to our website, which we'll be sharing at the end. I want to take us to a year ago last week. A year ago last week, Donald Trump signed this anti-homeless executive order. And I think about this executive order in two equal parts. One is language, one is words, one is narrative, and one is policy. And this executive order reeks of myths and stereotypes, often racist myths and stereotypes about people experiencing homelessness. And it's really alarming that not only the White House thought these things, but they were so confident and emboldened that they put them out on a piece of paper and put the seal of the president on them, right? We are in a new time where we are seeing increased and concerted attacks on people experiencing homelessness. And we're going to get much more into the weeds in policy by people much smarter than I am. But this executive order really does four things. It incentivizes communities to make it a crime to be homeless. We already know communities are moving at warp speed to increase laws to make it a crime to be homeless. This executive order attempts to undermine real solutions to homelessness. And regardless of what is coming out of the White House, we know that housing and support continue to be the best and the only solutions to homelessness. This order also promotes an increase in policies that take away people's rights. We see that in the push towards institutionalization. We see that, as Representative Takano was going to talk about, in the push to take away rights from homeless veterans. And this executive order attacks life-saving programs like harm reduction, programs that we know work, programs that actually save people's lives. And this order, as I hope will make it clear today, isn't just a piece of paper. It really has become a blueprint for a far-reaching policy that is impacting how cities show up, how cities attack homeless folks, how states are going to increase their attacks on homeless folks, and how the federal government has really fallen in line behind these attacks on homelessness. This is not just a policy paper, it has been a call to anti-homelessness action. And now I'm going to try to very quickly connect a bunch of dots, because part of what we try to do at the Law Center is help unearth some of the things that are happening behind the scenes, but that are happening without enough public attention. So many folks might be familiar with Palantir. Palantir is a tech company and that has made billions of dollars selling technology to militaries and to the US government, including technology that the government uses to find and detain migrants. But often they're not thought of as connected to homelessness, but that is not the case, sadly. So Palantir, one of the co-founders, is a guy named Joe Lonsdale. And Joe Lonsdale formed an organization called the Cicero Institute, which we'll get into in a second. But in short, it's a billionaire-backed think tank that's pushing all of these anti-homeless policies that has led to things like the grants pass ruling that impacted Trump's executive order, which led to the DC takeover, which also led to this proposal of the Utah detention camp. Was the EO was used to justify Louisiana's forced labor law. And as Mary Frances is going to talk about, the EO is being used to justify potentially catastrophic changes to federal funding. So all of these things might seem unconnected, but we hope that we're building the shared understanding that actually all of these things are deeply connected. So I mentioned the Cicero Institute, and as the next slide shows, the Cicero Institute is a far right-wing think tank founded by Palantir billionaire and tech bro Joe Lonsdale, and they have been pushing anti-homeless laws at the state level, including the law in Louisiana that Shayna is going to talk about, including the proposal for a massive detention camp in Utah that Evan is going to talk about. And we just dropped a link in the chat that shows the work of Cicero, and we'll also put a link in the chat that shows some of our own research that shows that Cicero has deep connections, including profit connections, to industries that stand to benefit from these laws and make it a crime to be homeless. And Cicero staff have talked openly about how they are advising the Trump administration on homelessness policy. And as a Cicero senior fellow said, the Trump administration took our conversations, took our recommendations, and made something out of it. We hear that the Cicero Institute is front and center on this, but they're not acting alone, right? They are acting with other institutions like the Heritage Institute, the Manhattan Institute, the Discovery Institute. And homelessness has become part of the culture war, and the White House has really taken up that mantle. And it's not a coincidence that we're seeing these attacks on homeless folks, right? This is part of a coordinated billionaire-backed effort to demonize people experiencing homelessness, to invoke often racist myths and stereotypes, and to take away people's rights. The next slide is an amazing graphic that my colleague Sam made that kind of breaks down how people stand to profit from these laws that they pass that make it a crime to be homeless. Again, we have in the chat some research that we released a few months ago that looks at the connections between Cicero, private prisons, weapons manufacturers, defense contractors, and the Trump administration that to me is just an important piece of this story. And then on the next slide talks about something that you may have seen. Tennessee passed an early Cicero bill, and one of the most extreme Cicero bills at that time, that not only makes it a crime for people to experience homelessness, but it makes homelessness a felony. And recently, two people, including Joseph Williams, were arrested and charged with a felony for sleeping outside. This is one of the many examples about how Cicero laws are hurting people, making homelessness worse, and impacting communities. And at the end of the article, after he gets released from incarceration, Joseph goes back to his camp because he doesn't have anywhere else to go. And to me, it just shows again and again and again that these laws that make it a crime to be homeless don't help solve homelessness. They actually make homelessness worse. We mentioned in the chat, we mentioned earlier that the Cicero Institute and many of these other organizations we mentioned lobbied or pressured the Supreme Court and in essence lobbied the court to decide in the case of Grants Pass that cities should make it a crime to be homeless. And about a month ago, we marked the 1-year anniversary of the Grants Pass decision. Since that decision, over 350 cities and 14 states have passed laws that make it a crime to be homeless. Many of these laws include things like $1,000 in fines or 6 months in jail. They do not include housing. They do not include healthcare. They do not include help. All they do is make homelessness worse. And the last thing I'll say before I turn it over to Congresswoman Ramirez is that this is textbook authoritarianism. We see throughout history what this looks like. We see the constant dehumanization of and taking away rights of people, but we also see this focus on blame shifting. We know that politicians would rather us blame people experiencing homelessness for our broken housing system than for us to realize that our housing system has been rigged by politicians and billionaires, right? They want us to blame our neighbors who can't afford rent, but we know the blame lies squarely at the feet of people in power. They're trying to distract us. We must not let them. And we have seen throughout history some of the natural ending of authoritarianism, forced removal, detention centers, and forced labor, which are all things that are either been proposed or already passed as legislation as it relates to homelessness. We also see the administration testing a power grab and forced detention of groups that are vulnerable, a spread of disinformation. They're using this language of fear and discomfort to enact a repressive agenda. And what stops with homeless folks, what stops with migrants, what starts with queer and trans folks won't stop there unless we rise up together and to make it stop. And that's something I know we can do. And in fact, we have to, because we really have no other choice. I'm proud to turn it over to Congresswoman Delia Ramirez from Chicago, who is leading this fight on many, many different levels. I'll pass it over to the Congresswoman.
Hi, everyone. My name is Congresswoman Delia Catalina Ramirez, and I have the honor of representing Illinois 3rd Congressional District. I want to start by acknowledging how difficult the last year has been for so many members of our communities. You see, for me, everything that is happening, cards of services Americans rely on, the polarization of grant making, mass detention and deportations, attacks on human rights defenders, and displacement and institutionalization of unhoused people, is all interconnected. And look, prior to coming to Congress, I spent almost 20 years of my life providing social services and doing policy work to help the unhoused population in Chicago. I witnessed firsthand the multi-layered effects of criminalization, stigmatization, and not having a stable home, or the impacts, right, that has actually had on unhoused neighbors. And we know that arresting, criminalizing, and institutionalizing our unhoused neighbors only compounds harm. Not only is it bad policy, it's cruelty. But cruelty is their point. Pain is their point. And we're clear that the administration will use pain for profit. Trump and his administration have never demonstrated a commitment to our rights, to due process, to the rule of law, or to human dignity. muscle clear that Trump and all those authoritarians and criminals in the administration, they want our lives, they want our labor, they want our freedom to extract every single bit of profit they can from us for themselves and their billionaire bosses. And as long as they profit, they don't really care if we're sick or we're starving or detained, deported, or even dead. It's why we have to draw a line in the sand. It's why we have to meet this moment and reject the tension in all its forms. Listen, this fight is far from over. In fact, it's just beginning. And it's going to be our solidarity that will protect us. From immigration criminalization to attacks on civil society, we're coming together across our coalitions to stand up and fight back. And we have to get into good trouble in the streets and in Congress and in the courts. It's why I introduced the Maltese Act to end immigration detention and monitoring, disrupt DHS immigration enforcement, and return taxpayer dollars to our communities. It's why I'm the co-chair of the Homelessness Caucus here, and I'm the proud co-sponsor of Housing Not Handcuffs, and why I stand opposed to any federal funding that creates detention camps or rolls back the rights of our unhoused neighbors. Look, no more mandatory detention, no more private detention facilities, no more family detention, no more punishing our unhoused neighbors. We have to reclaim our dignity. We must restore due process and end detention in all its forms. So let's fight for every single thing, including housing for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. And I just want to remind folks that we are recording this webinar. We will send it out to everyone who's registered, and we will also include many of the amazing links that we are sharing in the chat in that roundup. So don't worry about copying stuff down from the chat. We got you. We'll be sending this all out, and I'm really excited to turn it over to Mary Frances from the National Alliance to End Homelessness, who's going to help break this down better.
Thanks so much, Jesse. We can go ahead and move to the next slide. I'm Mary Frances Kenyon. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Chief Equity Officer at the Alliance. Jesse did a phenomenal job contextualizing the EO, but I want to kind of revisit what we saw in 2025 as a whole, because there's been sort of this waterfall of efforts by the current administration that have impacted what I'm really here to talk about, which is federal changes in funding, specifically with the COC program, and also some lawsuits that we have under our belt. So to contextualize what happened either before, during, or immediately following the release of the July 24th executive order on homelessness, we have to look at some of the other areas and actions taken by this administration. So in a very short period of time, we saw the federal staffing levels, specifically at HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, be reduced by 30%. And that was specific to the field offices that really felt the largest declines. I won't get into what field offices do, but they are sort of the front-facing technical assistance for grantees of federal funding through HUD. Then you think about also the current federal funding had experienced a number of delays. Many of you remember that federal grants and loan pause right at the top of the administration. I think the second week of the administration, people were locked out of grants management systems and couldn't draw down funding to serve people that needed the most. There was also a flurry of executive orders since the president's inauguration, and we saw this doubling down over and over again on immigration, this idea of quote unquote gender ideology and DEI efforts. Jesse did a great job of talking about federal enforcement. So those surges that we saw in places like DC, LA, Nashville, and other largely blue cities. And then, of course, the really horrible immigration enforcement efforts that continue to this day. Lastly, the one big beautiful bill was passed, and that is going to continue to shred our social safety net with the drastic changes to SNAP and Medicaid funding specifically, much of which is often used for people experiencing homelessness and formerly homeless individuals who have achieved housing stability. Next slide, please. I'm not going to kind of belabor this point because I think Jesse did a great job of summarizing what the executive order means. But in specific, the second bullet there, the calling on the secretaries of HHS and HUD to change grant award structures and end support for evidence-based practices, including harm reduction, which is not just life-saving for people grappling with substance use disorder, but also a heck of a, prevention strategy for communicable diseases. With that includes a departure from HUD's own longstanding approach, which was anchored in Housing First, an array of other really harmful provisions that Jesse spoke to. Next slide, please. So I want to spend some time just talking about the impacts of what we are seeing and have seen in the last year by the proposed changes as I contextualize with the other actions of this administration across federal agencies. And there are four different ways that you can think about these impacts. You can look at them from an individual level, which is the people focus. That's folks having to become homeless again. That is folks not having anywhere to go. That is people who are formerly homeless losing access not only to their housing and a place to call home, but also, and in some ways, equally important, losing their supportive services that help them remain members within their community that have stability. You've got system level impacts, community level impacts, and then nationwide. I'm not going to go through every single item on the slide here, but this again creates a cascading effect, not only to individuals, but our systems that are trying to do their best to serve people experiencing homelessness, our communities. There's an economic impact with when landlords lose their funding and have to go through evictions process. There's trust loss. And I think more importantly, the homeless response system was never designed to withstand and bear the failures of other sectors, whether that be the lack of housing production of deeply affordable and available housing for the most low income households, or just folks don't have access to health care and they get sick. And when they get sick, how are they able to navigate that? So there are just a whole realm of harmful impacts at different levels that will ultimately increase homelessness, criminalize people who are experiencing homelessness, particularly Black and Brown folks, particularly people with disabilities, and particularly trans and gay individuals. So I'm going to move us on to the next slide. Which is to talk a little bit about litigation. And I can't talk about our current lawsuit without talking about our past lawsuit. This slide just really demonstrates where we were. And just to summarize, we won on our biggest claims. We sued HUD and we won on our biggest claims. The courts found that HUD didn't think the impact what they were trying to do, so changing the funding structures of the COC program, they didn't think through the impact that it would have on people, communities, and programs. The court also found that they broke the law with its decision-making process and just being so late in their actions. Now, one thing that's of interest is that the judge declined to put a permanent stop to this for now. The judge also said that we could file a new complaint to challenge the most recent June FY26 NOFO so that they could close out our existing case. And that will lead me into the next slide, please. We did just that. So we are currently in active litigation. This suit challenges the drastic and unlawful changes to HUD's Continuum of Care program, which is a proven and bipartisan initiative that has long helped veterans, seniors, people with disabilities, youth, families, all of those different subpopulations of people experiencing homelessness, helping them to find stable housing. We can continue to see efforts by the administration to weaponize federal funding. So we're fighting back. We're not doing that alone. We are actually represented by a coalition of attorneys, including folks from the Law Center. And we also have a number of other nonprofit partners, as well as local governments and other local nonprofits. So the theme is solidarity, and I'm going to end on that note. We are fighting back in court, and we hope that the court finds in our favor. We trust that our attorneys have done a really good job, and I'll turn it back over to Jesse. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mary Frances, and I hope you saw all the hearts and the love, especially for the Alliance really leading the charge with so many of our partners to hold this administration accountable, and lots of love for winning. We know that when we come together and fight, we can, and in fact, often win. We can move to our next speaker, who is Representative Mark Takano, to talk about the impacts of Trump's anti-homeless executive order on veterans experiencing homelessness. I will pass it over to Representative Takano.
1 year ago, this administration chose handcuffs over housing. And 1 year later, I'm here to tell you, the results are exactly what we warned they would be. Let's break down what has and hasn't happened since the executive order criminalizing homelessness was signed last July. Since President Trump came into power, he has worked to destroy the systems that we rely on to end a person's homelessness. He cut funding for HUD and the continuums of care, forcing providers and nonprofits into court to fight to preserve the programs we know work to get and keep people stably housed. I commend the work of the National Homelessness Law Center in helping to lead that litigation fight. In the veterans space, the Trump administration, through Secretary Collins, gutted VA's workforce, making it harder for the agency to recruit and retain social workers, nurses, psychologists, and physicians, the clinical care teams that provide the wraparound services that make HUD-VASH the most successful permanent housing program in history. But sadly, this is all by design. The administration is dismantling the systems we know work to replace them with draconian measures that punish people for their housing status. Veterans have not been spared. Since the executive order, VA quietly and secretly developed a new plan called Safe Harbor, through which the agency would force veterans into involuntary guardianship. We know about this plan because of brave whistleblowers. The administration tells us again and again that none of this is connected to criminalizing homelessness. But VA's own documents paint a different picture and clearly states that Project Harbor was developed in response to the executive order. When the documentation lines up with the executive order word for word, you don't get to call it a coincidence. This is what I said a year ago, and I will say it again today. The solution to veteran homelessness isn't incarceration or institutionalization. It's housing. I think about the veterans who are still out there tonight, in trucks under overpasses, in the doorways of the country they defended. While this administration spends its energy writing a memorandum to take veterans' rights away instead of writing checks for housing and supportive services. It's time for this administration to prioritize the needs of its citizens instead of further enriching the billionaires that run for-profit prisons, institutional care programs, and think tanks like the Cicero Institute. I commend the dedicated boots on the ground who continue to fight the good fight and speak truth to power on behalf of those experiencing homelessness in communities across the country. So 1 year later, my message hasn't changed, and it isn't going to change. Rescind the executive order criminalizing homelessness. Fund the housing and solutions that work. Stop treating a housing crisis like a crime wave. Forced institutionalization will never work to end a person's homelessness. They need a key to a door and a home that's theirs. The solution will always be housing and not handcuffs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Representative Takano. And I'm going to pass it over to Jennifer from the Bazelon Center on Mental Health Law. Jennifer, take it away.
Thank you so much. I also want to thank Representative Takano for all of his work on the issues that the executive order has created with the VA, which we very much appreciate. So I want to talk about the impact of the executive order on people with mental health disabilities, mental health service systems. The executive order's approach has been incredibly damaging in multiple ways to people with mental health disabilities. First and foremost, with I think the overall message that it sends, which is to really double down on a false association of mental health with criminal justice, with criminalization and violence. This has been something that we have dealt with for many, many years, never something that we thought that we would hear from the federal government. Sort of demonizing people with mental health disabilities and suggesting that they are all criminals and that they don't deserve housing, that really they're sort of problem people and they just need to be locked up. And that really impacts people in so many ways in perpetuating myths and stereotypes, as Jesse talked about at the beginning. You know, are these people that you want in your workplaces as your neighbors, in your classrooms, etc.? And, you know, they are false stereotypes, but having the federal government legitimize those false associations and myths and stereotypes does really untold harms. Secondly, and more specifically, as folks have talked about, the executive order abandons housing strategies like Housing First that are key for many, many people with mental health disabilities. Without Housing First, we know for many years that people often have not been able to stay housed, that people have been turned out on the street over and over again. And we have seen the impact of the executive order, as Mary Frances talked about, in terms of HUD's follow through with, for example, the Continuum of Care program and the new conditions that they have placed on the Continuum of Care program. We are hopeful that the litigation will put a stop to those changes, but it's an incredibly real risk that affects thousands of people with mental health disabilities. And in so many of our settlements, in our community integration cases, there are so many people. The states are scrambling, the court monitors are worried because people are going to lose their housing if those NOFOs actually go into effect. You know, hopefully that litigation will continue to stop them from going to effect. But everybody is concerned that the housing that we fought so hard to get is going away. And I want to highlight one aspect of the NOFOs in particular that like for the bit of the continuum of care program that would continue to be for permanent supportive housing, the NOFOs actually deprioritize and effectively exclude people with mental health disabilities and people with substance use disorders from permanent supportive housing. And that is mostly who is in permanent supportive housing. So it is very peculiar and is certainly going to lead to increased homelessness, you know, quite the opposite of being a solution to homelessness. And then finally, I want to highlight how the executive order really flips the principles of mental health service systems on their head. It's really a backward approach to mental health and one that is antithetical to how our service systems are supposed to work. Our mental health service systems aim to give people the services they need so they can succeed in everyday life in their communities. And civil commitment and institutionalization are what happen when people don't get the services they need. In other words, they are generally what happens when there are service system failures. But in the executive order, civil commitment and institutionalization effectively become the goals that we are aspiring to. And what that comes down to is essentially saying we don't want to give people the services that they need to succeed. We want them to fail so that we can achieve our goal of civilly committing them, damaging their lives, and paying a whole lot more money for institutionalization. Doesn't make any sense to anybody that knows anything about mental health service systems, but to essentially aim for failure. But that is really what the executive order is doing. And if there were any doubt about that, it, I think, is dispelled by the press reports reporting that the White House perceived a conflict between the executive orders approach and the federal disability rights laws and the Supreme Court's Olmstead decision requiring that people with disabilities be served in the most integrated setting appropriate, be served in their own homes and communities. And so the White House requested and got a memo from the Justice Department that essentially reverses their position that they have held over decades from one administration to the next. Administrations across the aisle have promoted community integration for people with disabilities. And the federal government, in fact, has been the lead enforcer of Olmstead for people with disabilities. And now the Justice Department is saying for the first time in decades that the integration mandate is not actually a thing, that neither the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, nor Section 504, its predecessor, even have an integration mandate, and says if in fact they did, that it would likely be unconstitutional. And the Justice Department has now said that it will no longer be relying on the guidance that it used for years that was based on well-established law. All of the courts have interpreted Olmstead and the ADA and Section 504 to require an integration mandate. The DOJ's memo itself acknowledges that it is out of step with the courts and that states may get sued if they follow it. And so it is very, very concerning that the government has walked away from promoting community integration in the name of consistency with its homeless policy of, we're going to stop providing services to people in the community and start institutionalizing them. And the irony is in an era of HR 1, in an era where we have historic budget shortfalls and where states are cutting Medicaid services because their budgets are drained, the idea that states would be spending money on institutionalization, which costs 3 times or more as much as it costs to serve people in the community, is really, it's not going to happen, and it's absurd. And so certainly the disability community will fight this with everything we have. We have been fighting. It is bad law. It is bad policy. It is damaging to people's lives. It is prohibitively costly, and it makes no sense. So I'm going to turn it back to Jesse.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I really appreciate this frame you used of, setting people up for failure. The government can be helping people, but instead they're not only taking away the housing people need, they're taking away people's rights. And they're trying to go backwards, right, to this time of mass institutionalization. And we will not let that happen. I am really pleased to turn it over to Cassandra from the Drug Policy Alliance to look at the connections between the anti-homeless executive order and people who use drugs and drug policy in general. Cassandra, please take it away.
I want to begin with something I think everyone participating in this webinar believes. Every person deserves a safe place to sleep. Every family deserves to know their loved one have somewhere stable to come home to. Every neighborhood deserves to be healthy, vibrant, and safe. Those shouldn't be controversial ideas. And yet, we are living through a political moment where those basic aspirations are being turned upside down. Instead of asking why people cannot afford housing, why treatment is out of reach, why mental health services are underfunded, or why communities have been divested in for generations, We're being told that the problem is the people themselves. People who use drugs, people experiencing homelessness, people living with mental health disabilities, immigrants. The list keeps growing. That is not simply bad policy. It is the politics of authoritarianism. Authoritarian movements don't solve complex social problems. They simplify them. They identify someone to blame, convince the public that those people are dangerous, then ask us to trade away our freedoms in exchange for the promise of safety. We've seen this playbook before. For more than 50 years, the war on drugs has done more than shape drug policy. It has quietly reshaped the relationship between people and the government. Political leaders deliberately linked particular drugs with Black communities, Latino communities, immigrants, and poor neighborhoods, exploiting racial fear to build support for punishment instead of investment. The drug war taught us that when we're afraid, it's acceptable to give the government more power. It normalized expanded surveillance, civil asset forfeiture, militarized policing, and the idea that constitutional protections can become optional if the problem feels urgent enough. Criminalization became a governing strategy, a way of deciding who belongs, who deserves care, and who can be excluded in the name of public safety. That's why what we're seeing today isn't a departure from the drug war. It's an expansion of it. The same political logic that justifies the criminalization of people who use drugs is now being applied to people experiencing homelessness. Visible poverty is increasingly treated as a public safety threat instead of evidence of policy failures. Encampments become something to eliminate rather than a symptom to solve. Housing becomes conditional on compliance instead of a foundation of stability. And the government responds with more policing, more coercion, and fewer investments in the things that actually make communities healthy. That's how authoritarianism grows. Not all at once. It grows by convincing us that each new exception is reasonable, that each new group deserves fewer rights than everyone else, that each expansion of government power is necessary because this problem is different. The attacks on people who use drugs and the attacks on people experiencing homelessness are not separate fights. They are part of the same project. Housing advocates understand something that many others are only beginning to understand. Housing is much more than shelter. Housing is belonging. Housing is stability. Housing is democracy in practice. Because it is incredibly difficult to participate in your community or your democracy when you don't know where you'll sleep tonight. That's why one of the policies we're working on changing is the Thurmond Amendment. Many people have never heard of it, but for nearly 4 decades, it has quietly allowed people with certain drug distribution convictions to be denied the protections of the Fair Housing Act simply because of their record. Even after someone has served their sentence, they can continue to face barriers to obtaining housing that most Americans would never imagine. Repealing the Thurmond Amendment isn't just about correcting an outdated law. It's about rejecting the idea that people should carry a life sentence of exclusion. It's about saying that housing should be a pathway to stability, not another tool of punishment. Because when someone leaves incarceration without a safe place to live, we shouldn't be surprised when recovery becomes harder, overdose risk increase, families are destabilized, and homelessness grows. That's not accountability. That's authoritarianism. And it reminds us of something important. The opposite of authoritarianism is creating communities where no one has to earn their humanity, where we respond to suffering with care instead of coercion, where we understand that housing, healthcare, treatment, and economic opportunity are not rewards for perfect behavior. They are the foundations that allow people to rebuild their lives. The good news is we already know what works. Supportive housing works. Housing first works. Voluntary treatment works. Peer support works. Communities become safer when we invest in people instead of abandoning them. That's why I think the housing movement and the drug policy movement are natural partners. Not simply because our constituencies overlap, not simply because we face many of the same political attacks, but because we are confronting the same governing logic and we are building the same alternative. We're both fighting for a society that refuses to define people by the hardest moments in their lives. One that understands that safety doesn't come from making people disappear. It comes from making sure everyone has what they need to live with dignity. The answer to authoritarianism isn't simply resisting what we're against. It's building something stronger together. A country where housing is understood as infrastructure for democracy, where care is understood as public safety, and where no one is made disposable because they are poor, because they use drugs, because they've been incarcerated, or because they have nowhere to call home.
Thank you so much, Cassandra, for both your clarity and just helping us connect all of those dots. Before we transition to how this executive order is showing up on the state level, I want to just make one observation, which is that the federal agencies falling in line with Trump's anti-homeless executive order shows what a federal coordinated response to homelessness looks like. It is a bad response. It is an immoral response. It is the wrong response. It is a response that will make homelessness worse and will make more and more people suffer. But I wonder what would it look like if we had a federal response to homelessness that actually helped people? What if every agency, what if every administration jumped in and used their power to help people make ends meet, to help lower the rent, to help get people the care and support they need? Because as Cassandra mentioned, this is what everybody wants and needs. Everybody needs a safe place to live. Everybody needs the care and support they want. But instead of bringing us closer to that reality, just reflecting on this webinar, we're going backwards so quickly, and it just feels like such an important time for us to continue our work, not only to stop these cuts and stop the harm, but to build a new vision for the future, one where everyone has a safe place to live. I'm really excited to call up my longtime bud, Andy Wasenick from Miriam's Kitchen, who's going to talk about the impacts of Trump's anti-homeless executive order in Washington, D.C. Thanks, Andy.
Yeah, hey everyone, really happy to be here. To back up a little bit, actually, what um, kind of precedes this is that in advance of the oh my goodness of the Supreme Court case. Why is it? I'm blanking on it. That the city and the National Park Service had decided that they weren't going to hedge their bets on the Supreme Court's decision to grants pass, and they cleared what were the last remaining large encampments in the city that were like maybe 40, 30 people. There were a number of them that they cleared and like dispersed people into smaller and smaller encampments between that time and when Trump is inaugurated. And what we see over that time, and especially after grants pass, is that there's an acceleration of clearing and a continued pursuit of these smaller encampments until they're even smaller and smaller, and people are even more spread out. So fast forward to the executive order, and of course, when it first came out, everybody was just kind of like dumbstruck and trying to figure out what it would mean. And certainly, if you followed the letter of the law, like DC does not have the capacity to do what it's asking to do in terms of like putting people, into mental health treatment. Our state hospital has a grand total of 287 beds. We don't have that kind of capacity. Half of those beds, or more than half of those beds, go to the criminal justice system for pretrial evaluation. Our drug treatment programs are, at or near capacity most of the time. And we don't have the capacity to shelter all of our unhoused residents, even if everybody wanted it. For the full year, we will give everybody a bed who wants one during the hypothermia season, but it's not year round. And every year we put about 500 or 600 people back out on the street come April. So everybody's trying to figure that out. And then about 2 weeks later, he posts on Truth Social some pictures of some encampments, small encampments that are remaining that he has to drive past every time he goes to the Kennedy Center. And he used some really vitriolic and ugly language as he does, dehumanizing the folks who are living in those places. And that really just unleashes what becomes a circus for the next couple of weeks. All of a sudden, those encampments that are remaining on public land here in DC, we have federal Park Service. Park Service land is land that is administered by the federal government, and then there's city land, and it's often confusing as to what is federal land and what is city land, and determining all of that. Needless to say, the folks who were on federal land, who were pictured or nearby, their encampments were cleared within 48 hours. The ones that were on city territory, a couple of them, the smaller ones, were also given 48 hours to clear. And then the largest remaining one, which was maybe had like 12 or 15 people at it, there was a battle between the local government and the federal government over who got the privilege to clear that encampment. And then there was one like remaining encampment at Washington Circle in the city near the George Washington University campus that was also like was going to be cleared, and the city fought very valiantly for the right to be able to clear that. And so on the day, and in that time, we were getting the conversations from the local government being like the federal government, they're going to set out federal troops, federal law enforcement out to clear all visible sites of homelessness in the downtown area, near the White House and around town. But nobody knew exactly when it was going to start. There was lots of false starts and everything. And then it turned out on the day that the city did clear this last larger encampment, and in their doing of it, it was like, timely. People were given time to pack up their stuff and move on. There was no like gun to their head or anything of that nature. That night, though, we got word that the federal troops were indeed going to start fanning out, and we weren't sure where they were going to go. But we had a hunch that they were going to go to Washington Circle, where there were probably about 6 or 8 tents around that circle. And I was sitting with Jesse in that park, sort of waiting for the arrival of the very surreal moment when about 16 or 18 FBI agents in gray fatigues kind of walked in as a unit into the circle. And then before you knew it, it was just a media circus. There were reporters all over the place. Folks from the local government were showing up. City council members, directors of the Human Services, Department of Human Services were there, and legal advocates for the homeless were present. And what had happened is earlier in the day that the city, this was a Thursday, the city had slapped stickers on the tents that were in the circle saying they had until Monday to clear, and the feds wanted to clear them right there, and they had trash trucks there ready to go and do the job. And what transpired was this argument between city officials and the feds there on the street corner over whether or not they could stay or not. And ultimately, it seemed that the city prevailed, and the feds sort of wandered off, and they went down to near the White House, Lafayette Park. And then they went over to a church, it's about a mile from Washington Circle, and talked to some folks who slept outside of a church that has a day center in it. And at the end of that, like, they were like, "Yep, well, this is all what we're doing." They didn't arrest anybody. They didn't really do anything. They said, "We'll be back out here tomorrow night." And so they sent everybody home with instructions to like alter your hours. All the outreach workers in the city, who were present for this, to alter your hours and, work in afternoon and evening shifting rather than work in the morning. And the next thing you know, the very next morning, well, in the meantime, what they did was they fired the chief of police, and under the orders of Pam Biondi, the following morning, Washington police and trash went to that church, and they cleared about 30 people from that church, and then they raced over to Washington Circle, and they threw everybody's stuff away in about 10 minutes. And it was really breathtaking. There was one woman who was there with her stuff, who was allowed to pack up and go, but everything else just went in the back of a truck. And there was a couple that had a tent there, and they were both disabled, and they were not present, and they lost everything. And everybody who had stuff there, aside from that one woman who happened to be present when nobody was working, right? Because they had sort of let us believe that nothing was going to happen in the morning. And it was really breathtaking. And so what happened in the following weeks is that like there was some more, that was like the main clearing that they did, but the city then, everybody was experiencing homelessness, was certainly unsettled and scared, and trying to keep themselves safe and out of harm's way. And we were trying to do that for everybody as well. The city, a few weeks later, then had a count, our own like impromptu point in time count to see how many people were, remained. And and folks got cleared after that count, and so we were all feeling like suckers. And then they basically, the city said to us and the other outreach providers in the city that tents are not allowed in the city. If you have a tent, it's going to go. And so since then, the few folks who still use tents pack them up in the morning and carry them with them or put them off somewhere safe. It's really been a bizarre year. There's this weird stasis now where, nobody has a tent, but of course, everybody's homeless. Folks are a lot less trusting of service providers. They just don't trust anybody right now. A lot of folks don't really differentiate between the federal government and the city government, and sort of certainly different branches of the city government. And so it's really kind of sad and frustrating. And then under the backdrop of all this, like what has been talked about the HUD changes and everything else, is that like we too are facing that, and the whole thing is sort of given the mayor in particular, the cover to gut housing services, homeless services, and other services as well, from health insurance to you name it. And we continue to sort of like be in this purgatory, if you will, over what we are allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do, both in homeless services and also on our government level and passing a budget. I would say that like one of the things that was happening in the midst of all of this was, there were press conferences at the White House, and they were saying that they were going to offer people like 4 or 5 choices. They could go to, they could go to the psych ward, they could go to treatment, they could go to shelter, or they could get lost. And, that wasn't anything that we really saw happening anywhere. We have certainly seen an increase in criminalization for crimes of poverty, for open containers. We've seen, it's hard to get information on this, but, there's been an increase of involuntary hospitalization, but like that doesn't mean people are being hospitalized for long term. They're just being taken for evaluation, and then they're being put back out on the street 2 or 3 days later. So that's about where we are with that, and hope brighter days are coming.
Thank you, Andy, and to the whole everyone in DC trying to keep folks safe. And this is Donald Trump's vision for the country, right? Like this is what he wants to happen in cities across the country. He's able to enact it quickly, or he was able to enact it quickly in DC because DC, the federal government, controls a large portion of our land. But this is pretty clearly his vision. And I also want to remind folks, a little moderators, privilege. DC is still occupied by the National Guard. We have now, I think, about 5,000 National Guard troops here. And we're spending, I think, between $1.2 and $2 million a day. And the government recently announced they found they were going to provide housing for thousands of National Guard troops at taxpayer expense, which is shocking because for decades, or for years, the government has been telling us for decades that they can't find housing for people. And it just makes you wonder, why can they find housing for some people and not for everybody? And folks, please, this is my plea to folks who don't live in DC. Please check out Free DC. We're going to put a link to the chat in the chat, but please contact your lawmakers and tell them to end the federal occupation of DC. We saw how the EO was operationalized in DC. That was one of the first places we saw it happen, if not the first place. I'm now going to turn it over to Evan Dones, who's going to talk about how the executive order was used to justify the Utah governor's attempt to create a 1,300-bed homeless detention center. Thank you, Evan.
Thanks, Jesse. Hi, everyone. My name is Evan Doan. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Advocacy and Public Policy Director for the statewide recovery community organization here in Utah. I'm also a person in long-term recovery from a substance use disorder myself, and I have lived experience of homelessness. So for those of you that aren't aware of what happened here in Utah this last year, about a year ago, our state's government, sponsored by the governor and supported by right-wing think tanks like the Cicero Institute, proposed a massive massive 15-acre homeless campus on the edge of the Great Salt Lake. This is going to be a 1,300 bed facility, supposedly for some sort of treatment and recovery. But the really disturbing thing was that they were planning on weaponizing our civil commitment process here in Utah to wholesale round up people experiencing homelessness and put them into this facility against their will. Over half the beds were dedicated to that purpose. And so we knew that we had to act quickly and to get ahead of this thing as fast as we could. And so we reached out to the National Homeless Law Center. We worked with partners like the ACLU of Utah, the Disability Law Center here in Utah, various service providers across the state to launch a campaign in opposition to this. And so we kind of, in conjunction with our national partners, came up with this no federal funding for homeless detention camps idea that specifically demanded that HUD reject any requests to utilize federal funding to pay for something like this. One of the things that we kind of knew ahead of time was that our legislature here in Utah for the last few years has been claiming poverty, and so they don't have the funding resources necessary to build a facility like this, even though the dollar figures that were proposed grossly underestimated the cost. We still didn't have the money to do it, and so it was going to require federal funding to make that happen. Luckily, that federal funding never materialized, but we were still interested in fighting this in a few different ways. So some of the messaging that we used, I think, fairly effectively here was threefold. So first, we wanted to focus on how involuntary commitment for people, especially people with mental health and substance use conditions, is an ineffective strategy. It doesn't do anything to address the root causes of homelessness or addiction. And we've seen, throughout our history that, rounding up vulnerable populations and placing them behind locked doors has never really solved a crisis like this. And it's certainly not a housing crisis. And then second, we really focused on the misuse of resources, that this amount of money could be much better utilized in other ways, and that the dollar figure that was attached to this proposal was incorrect from the very beginning. They were really underestimating what it was going to cost, and it was the true cost of it was going to be much more expensive. And then third, we really highlighted the need for real solutions here in the state, that we had to prioritize permanent supportive housing, intensive case management, wraparound services, voluntary community resources, and really kind of shift the conversation away from this institutionalization and expansion argument. Ultimately, this proposal faced a lot of pushback from a lot of different groups that some of which we had intentionally partnered with, some of which came along almost accidentally because of the proximity to the lake. We also had a number of environmentalists that joined the cause in fighting against this proposal. But I think that one of the more strategic decisions we made as part of this process was to mobilize the philanthropic community here in Utah to say that we will not fund this. And so we reached out to some of the major family foundations here across the state and talked to them all about this proposal, and they were unified in their opposition to it. And they expressed that opposition to our legislators and to the governor's office in saying that they would not step up to help fund this thing. And one of those family foundations, in fact, even went so far as to make a $10 million donation directly to our existing shelter system as kind of a not so quiet, I don't know, middle finger to the proposal that they were coming up with. So I think that really helped turn the tides of this argument, having these philanthropists and the philanthropic community say, this is not what we're going to do here in the state. We're not going to come to the financial rescue of the state and trying to make this happen. And I would love to think that was ultimately what turned the tide on this altogether. However, I would say that I think that most of us here on the ground suspect that if the funds were to materialize magically somehow, this would still happen. And so we're all very wary that if the federal government were to provide funding to the state of Utah to make something like this happen, it could very well still occur. And so we're continuing to fight this. We're continuing to stay ahead of this argument as best we can and have the conversations with people about the fundamental flaws in this kind of model. But I think that it's wise that we all be wary of that this could come anywhere. I mean, Utah was, I think, used as the test case, but just because it didn't work here doesn't mean that they couldn't try elsewhere. And I know that there have been a number of states where they've started to propose similar kinds of ideas. And again, this has been, largely driven by, Palantir's Cicero Institute, kind of right-wing think tanks that have been advancing this agenda. And ultimately, I think that part of their goal is to also leverage people's kind of inherent stigma that they might have towards people with mental health and substance use conditions or people experiencing homelessness, to say, look, this population of people really doesn't want the help, so we have to force them into it. When we know that, ultimately, there's not, I don't believe that people are ever treatment resistant. I think that programs are people resistant, and so we really have to make sure that we're building programs that are meeting people where they're at, and that they're helping people, meet their basic needs, that are low barrier access to services, not these involuntary commitment strategies. So thanks so much for being here. Happy to answer any questions later.
Thank you, Evan. I want to highlight maybe three things. One, today's Evan's birthday. So, Evan, happy birthday. Thanks for joining us on your birthday. I hope you're going to do something fun after this.
This is fun.
This is fun. Two, we're having an honest conversation about the U.S. government and the state of Utah forcing homeless people into a detention camp. And I think it's important to remind people that we have seen this before, and at no time in human history has forcing people into a camp been a good thing. And it is terrifying we are having this conversation now, but we're having it because we need to. And third, and I say this as we transition to Shayna, both the law in Utah, the proposal in Utah, and the law that Shayna is going to talk about in New Orleans, were pushed for in part by the governor's desire, explicit desire, to comply with Trump's executive order, right? So we have seen both in Utah and in Louisiana, politicians say we have to adopt these anti-homeless policies because of the executive order. So again, we're trying to remind everyone that this executive order is not just words on a page. It is having very real consequences all across the country. And with that, I'll turn it over to Shayna, who's going to talk about Louisiana's forced labor law. Shayna, I'm so glad you're able to join us.
Hello, everybody. Thank you. Thanks, Justin, for having me. My name is Shayna Bessinet, and I'm from New Orleans. I'm representing the People's Council, and the People's Council is a collective of people who have lived experience, giving their input on it, on actually the reality of the streets, not about the laws that are made in that building, from people who don't have any experience or know the reality of it. Here in June, our governor passed the bill to criminalize people for being poor. Poverty is not a crime. And what happens is they can serve up to 6 months in jail and have a $500 fine, and be forced for unpaid labor. This is absurd and ridiculous. And having lived experience, as by the way, I'm a registered dental hygienist, been homeless since 2022. I had a car most of that time, was in a shelter from September till this past March. I still wake up in the mornings and I still serve the homeless, and I still, hear their stories. And just this morning, when I was serving them breakfast, one told me that he stays by the river. He has no place to stay, and he's just staying by the river. And at 6 this morning, a National Guard poked him to see if he was sleeping and said he couldn't be there. And he said, I'm just sitting by the river. How is this a crime? He said, well, we'll remove your sunglasses. I gotta make sure you weren't just sleeping. So this is ridiculous. And it tells us in the Bible, in Proverbs, it says to speak up for those who cannot speak up for themselves and defend the rights of the poor. And that's why I'm here, because I've witnessed so many good people in my experience, people that have just disabilities, whether it's physical or mental. They don't have enough money. Housing is so expensive. They are not choosing to be homeless. I heard someone say people choose to be homeless. No, nobody's choosing to be homeless. Nobody's choosing to be homeless. One be like most people, they have a disability, just missing, having a medical crisis landed them on the street. A lot of women that I stay in the shelter with, they're fleeing abusive relationships. So many horrific stories. They're dealing with so much trauma. And from experience, whether you're living on a street or in a shelter, it doesn't matter. Your nervous system is not regulated at all. You're still sleeping with one eye open, whether you're in a shelter or on the street. And your cortisol level is so high, and you're in this fight or flight mode the whole time. So the solution is not jails. The solution is housing. Once you give somebody a house and they can close that door behind them, then their nervous system will start to relax. It will start to be regulated. They will feel safe. They will have stability. Once they can close a door behind them, then they're able to get back into society and get back into the economy and be productive, because they want to. They want to work. They want to give back. But you cannot give back when you are sleeping with one eye open. And I'm sorry, y'all, but this is serious. And to criminalize people for being poor is exactly what the Bible warns us about, these unjust laws. And if we stay in together, which I know that's what this webinar right here is wonderful. Thank you, Jesse, for inviting me. Thank you for everyone for listening, because we the people have the power, not them. We have the power. So once we stand up and rise together, we can fight this. We just have to educate each other and educate the world, because if this can happen in Louisiana, then this can happen anywhere. And it's going to, if we don't do something and stand up. So that's all I have to say. Thank you all for listening to me. And thank you, Jesse.
Dana, I'm so glad that you're able to join us. Thank you for your continuous advocacy. I really encourage folks to check out the link we dropped in the chat to Shayna's testimony against this Louisiana bill. And as a reminder, this Louisiana bill that was championed by the Cicero Institute not only makes it a crime to be homeless, but paves the way to force homeless people into doing unpaid labor. This evokes debtors' prisons, Jim Crow, prison, just all of the worst parts, or many of the worst parts of our nation's history. And in Louisiana specifically, which is the incarceration capital of our country, which is the incarceration capital of the world, this is extremely, extremely alarming. And I do want to say, in Louisiana, we thought this bill would be passed without a second thought. And due to the amazing advocacy and mobilization of Shayna and so many people, this bill became really controversial. And while we didn't win, we were able to mount, and they were able to mount, an incredibly successful campaign that educated the public and that helped people understand what was really on the line. I'm going to turn it over to our last speaker, a good friend of the Law Center, Congressmember Maxwell Frost. Congressmember, please take it away.
Today marks a year since President Trump signed his executive order that is anti-homeless people. And what I mean by this is it is on the same trend that cities and towns have been taking across this country to criminalize homelessness. We know that homelessness is a housing problem. In order to fix it, we need housing, not handcuffs. And we're going to need leadership that's going to lower the cost of rent, make sure that we have more pathways to home ownership, but also heavily invest in things like rental assistance, permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, and homeless services across this country. We know that it is both cheaper and less challenging for us as a nation to keep our people housed. So let's put the money where it needs to go. Making sure that we're fighting against these horrible laws. We know that the horrible, disastrous Grants Pass Supreme Court decision has unlocked an ability for cities and towns to criminalize homeless people for the failures of politicians, but we will continue to fight back because we know that in order to solve the housing crisis, it's not going to be because we arrested homeless people, it's going to be because we did what we needed to do to lift them up, to support them, and to ensure that we solve the housing crisis in the United States of America. This type of stuff is lazy. This type of stuff shows who's going to be a spineless politician and who's actually there to fight for the resources that we need for our communities. Homelessness is a housing problem. Let's fix the housing crisis, and let's not resort to handcuffs when all we need is housing and investment in our people and our community. In the richest country on the face of the earth, no one should live on the streets, no one should live in their car, no one should live in a hotel, and every American should have housing as a human right. God bless you, and I'll see you out there.
Thank you so much, Congressmember Frost. We are coming to the end of our program. And as I hope we've made clear, we're up against literal billionaires, right? We're up against Joe Lonsdale, who made billions of dollars at Palantir, who was funding and fueling the rise in these anti-homeless laws. And these billionaires have a vested interest and a sometimes financial interest, not just in the anti-homeless laws they push, but in maintaining the status quo of a broken housing system. They want to maintain a broken housing system that leaves people with no choice but to sleep outside. But we know it doesn't have to be like this. We also know we will never outspend them, right? We are not going to outmoney billionaires, but we can and we must outorganize them. And one way to outorganize them is for you all to join our movement and to help us spread the word about our work and this work across the country. To do so, please subscribe and join our Housing Not Handcuffs campaign at housingnothandcuffs.org/join. In addition to joining our movement, we need you to get loud. Politicians are responding to what people are talking about. And if you have seen the conversations about homelessness on Nextdoor, at town council meetings, or on your neighborhood Facebook group, you know that these conversations are dominated by and rooted in misunderstandings and myths. They're wrong. We know they're wrong, but they are so loud, y'all. So we have to get louder. We have to drown them out and break through with real solutions and remind people that housing and support work. And we have to show politicians that more of us care about fixing our rigged housing system than do about making it a crime to be homeless. We also have to help people understand that solving homelessness doesn't just help the folks who are moving from the streets into housing, although that is certainly the group of people that I care the most about, and that is the group of people that are impacted the most. But truthfully, solving homelessness makes us all better. It impacts us all. Ensuring that everyone has a safe place to live builds stronger and healthier communities. It also enables justice to take root and thrive. Solving homelessness shows that we care about each other. Solving homelessness means that we have a system that puts people before profit. And one of the ways you can do that is to join the conversation. That can be online, that can be in person, that can be in the ballot box or in the streets. And another way to get plugged in and get loud is to follow and amplify the amazing work of all of the organizations that were discussed and presented during this call. Stay informed, stay loud, get plugged in, because when we do that, we can ensure that everybody has a safe place to call home. Before we close, I again want to thank the almost 400 people who joined us from all over the world for this phenomenal conversation. We're going to be emailing out this recording. We'll be emailing out many of the links. You will continue to hear from us. A ton of gratitude to all of our presenters. And I want to give a special shout out to Sam and Gwen from the National Homeless Law Center team who are running things behind the show. They're making everything look good. Thank you both so much. And thanks to the whole Law Center team. Thank you, everyone. We're going to wrap up a few minutes early, but my ask is use those 7 minutes, use these 6 minutes we have left to get loud. Follow these organizations, subscribe to their lists. Tell your council members that you care about this, lobby your senators, make appointments to meet with elected officials, get loud, get organized, because together we've got each other's backs and we're going to build a housing system that works for everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Have a great afternoon.